Imagine living in a country where your presence alone sparks fear, suspicion, and tension simply because of the color of your skin. This is the reality that Black Americans have faced for centuries. And it is a story that continues to shape society today. From the earliest days of slavery, a fear was planted, one that has grown roots in laws, institutions, and the way people perceive one another. Jim Crow laws reinforced these fears, creating barriers designed to control, marginalize, and suppress an entire group of people. And even after legal segregation ended, systemic racism quietly persisted, embedded in everything from education and healthcare to policing and media representation. But what is striking is how this fear has nothing to do with individual actions. Studies show that the fear of Black Americans often stems not from personal experience, but from centuries of power dynamics, guilt, and a refusal to reckon with history. It is a fear of potential, a fear of greatness, and a fear of change. Black Americans have contributed immeasurably to culture, innovation, and society, yet their achievements are often minimized, erased, or co-opted. In this video, we are going to explore why this fear exists, where it comes from, and how it continues to influence American life. We will look at history, real-life stories, and surprising examples of resilience and brilliance that challenge the myths and prejudices still embedded in our society. If you are ready to uncover the truth behind these fears and see the impact of history on the present, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because this is a story that demands to be seen, heard, and understood. Stay with us, because what you are about to learn might change the way you see the world. From the earliest days of this nation, fear has been a tool wielded to maintain control, to shape society according to the desires of those in power, and to justify the injustices inflicted on Black Americans. This fear was never born from personal encounters or actual threats. It was carefully cultivated through generations, nourished by the intertwined forces of power, guilt, jealousy, and the pervasive ideology of white supremacy. In plantations and courtrooms, in schools and workplaces, Black Americans were cast not as fellow humans, but as symbols of a threat that existed only in the minds of those seeking to dominate them. Every law passed, every restriction enforced, and every stereotype perpetuated was part of an invisible architecture of fear, designed to maintain a social order that favored some while systematically suppressing others. It is a fear that betrays its own fragility, for it acknowledges the potential and power of those it seeks to intimidate. The fear of Black Americans is inseparable from the envy of their creativity, resilience, and humanity. When enslaved people sang in the fields, crafted ingenious solutions under impossible constraints, or nurtured communities in spite of oppression, they demonstrated a vitality that white society both needed and resented. This contradiction, the simultaneous need for and fear of Black brilliance, created a tension that has endured for centuries. Media, literature, and folklore have all been enlisted to exaggerate this threat, to portray Black Americans as dangerous or subversive, not because reality supports it, but because maintaining fear preserves social hierarchy. Guilt plays its own subtle yet powerful role. The collective awareness of past atrocities, of human lives commodified and discarded, fuels a subconscious anxiety that manifests as suspicion and avoidance. White Americans were taught to fear the descendants of those they once enslaved, not because of evidence, but because confronting the truth would destabilize the carefully constructed narrative of innocence and superiority. Jealousy, too, quietly intensifies this fear, for it is impossible to fear someone without recognizing their capabilities, their talents, and the strength that has allowed them to survive and thrive against impossible odds. Even today, the echoes of these fears shape public perception and policy. Communities are policed differently, opportunities are allocated unequally, and representation is constantly negotiated and contested. Yet within this landscape of fear, Black Americans continue to create, innovate, and redefine what it means to belong in a society that has long questioned their place within it. The fear may be widespread, but it is built on illusion, not truth, and it is precisely the resilience, the intellect, and the enduring presence of Black communities that exposes its emptiness. Understanding this dynamic is not merely a lesson in history. It is an invitation to see the ways in which fear can be manufactured, internalized, and ultimately resisted, reminding us that what is imagined as threatening is often the most human and vital part of society. Throughout history, the story of Black innovation has been one of brilliance shadowed by erasure, a constant struggle to have creativity and achievement recognized in a society eager to downplay both. Inventors like Garrett Morgan, who revolutionized safety with the traffic signal, or Nathan Nearest Green, whose expertise helped perfect the bourbon-making process, did not simply contribute to American life, they reshaped it. Yet their names are often footnotes, their accomplishments footnotes in textbooks, overshadowed by a narrative that privileges the familiar faces of white inventors and entrepreneurs. This pattern is not coincidental. It is the direct result of a society that, while dependent on Black ingenuity, has long sought to minimize its presence, as if to suggest that progress could exist without those it was indebted to. From the workshops of the 19th century to the laboratories and tech hubs of today, Black creators have continually demonstrated ingenuity in the face of systemic obstacles. Yet their contributions are often reframed or omitted altogether. Consider the countless innovations that touch everyday life, from the gas mask and improved traffic signaling systems to life-saving medical advancements. The fingerprints of Black inventors are everywhere, quietly embedded into the fabric of society, while the public record often denies or forgets them. This erasure extends beyond mere recognition. It shapes perception, teaching generations to undervalue and overlook the cultural and intellectual contributions of a people who, despite oppression, have consistently transformed challenges into opportunity. Modern innovators continue this legacy, redefining industries, art forms, and technology. Yet even now their achievements are subject to marginalization or overshadowed by dominant narratives. The patterns established during slavery, Jim Crow, and segregation when Black accomplishment was often met with suspicion, restricted from full participation, or claimed by others still echo in subtle ways. Recognition is not merely symbolic, it affects access to funding, networks, and platforms that allow ideas to grow and impact society. When history erases Black inventors and innovators, it is not just a matter of lost credit. It is an ongoing mechanism that diminishes influence, stifles visibility, and perpetuates a false sense of who contributes to progress. Yet the truth persists. The creativity, resilience, and problem-solving that Black Americans have exhibited across centuries continue to challenge the narratives built to minimize them. Each breakthrough, each invention, each creative work pushes back against the historical forces that sought to render them invisible. By tracing these contributions, from the ingenuity that made factories safer and beverages richer to the technological marvels shaping modern life, one begins to see the profound impact of Black innovation as an enduring force that society cannot simply erase. Recognition, when it comes, is not a gift. It is an overdue acknowledgement of talent and determination that has always existed, even when systems conspire to obscure it. In understanding this history, it becomes clear that the fear, jealousy, and systemic control that have sought to suppress Black accomplishment are inseparable from the broader story of innovation in America. The very society that feared and attempted to contain Black talent ultimately depended on it to thrive. And the erasure of these contributions reflects a tension between necessity and prejudice, between acknowledgement and denial. This narrative reminds us that progress is never created in isolation, and that honoring the full scope of human creativity requires confronting the uncomfortable truths of history. Recognizing those who built, imagined, and transformed the world even when history tried to look the other way. From the moment a child wakes up in a neighborhood shaped by redlining to the experiences felt in classrooms underfunded for decades, structural racism weaves itself into the very fabric of daily life, leaving an indelible mark on every interaction and opportunity. In policing, it manifests not merely in individual bias but in patterns of surveillance, arrest, and sentencing that disproportionately target Black communities, creating a landscape where fear and mistrust are passed down through generations. Education, meant to be a ladder toward possibility, often instead reinforces systemic inequities. Schools in predominantly Black neighborhoods receive fewer resources, less experienced teachers, and limited access to advanced programs, shaping futures long before students leave the building. Healthcare mirrors these disparities, with chronic underfunding, implicit bias in treatment, and limited access to preventative care leaving Black Americans more vulnerable to disease and early mortality. Outcomes that are not inevitable but engineered by long-standing inequities. Housing and infrastructure tell a similar story. Decades of discriminatory practices, from redlining to predatory lending, have constrained Black families to neighborhoods that were deliberately deprived of investment, making it difficult to build generational wealth and exposing residents to environmental hazards. Inadequate public transportation and limited access to employment opportunities. Economic systems compound these challenges, as wage barriers to entrepreneurship and restricted access to capital persistently undermine upward mobility, ensuring that the promise of the American dream remains elusive for many despite talent, ambition, and hard work. These systems do not operate in isolation. They reinforce one another, creating feedback loops that entrench disadvantage while obscuring the forces that sustain it. Yet within this reality, resilience and ingenuity continue to shine. Black communities find ways to thrive, build wealth, educate children, and create networks of support in the very spaces designed to limit them, demonstrating a creativity born from necessity. Grassroots initiatives, cooperative businesses, and cultural institutions emerge as lifelines, subtly reshaping the contours of opportunity even in a society structured to deny it. Understanding structural racism requires seeing beyond individual acts of prejudice to recognize the invisible scaffolding that dictates who succeeds, who struggles, and who is rendered invisible. It is not simply a matter of unfairness in isolated incidents. It is the orchestration of policy, practice, and perception over generations that shapes the lived experiences of millions. Infrastructure, from public transit to broadband access, can dictate the very possibilities of a life, influencing where one can work, learn, and access healthcare, while economic policies and zoning regulations determine the long-term viability of neighborhoods. The consequence is a world in which talent and ambition collide with systemic barriers, where the potential of an individual is constrained not by personal failure, but by the architecture of society itself. Yet the stories of triumph within Black communities illuminate the truth that human creativity and perseverance are not so easily contained, and that each success challenges the assumptions and structures designed to suppress it. Recognizing the depth and reach of structural racism is not merely an exercise in critique. It is an essential step toward imagining a society in which opportunity, justice, and dignity are genuinely available to all. A society where the invisible lines of constraint can finally be redrawn in the service of equity. In places like Sugar Land, Texas, the echoes of history are impossible to ignore, as the land itself carries the weight of a past built on the backs of enslaved people and later reinforced by the brutal system of convict leasing, where freedom was conditional and justice was a commodity sold to the highest bidder. The sprawling plantations and the infamous prison farms that followed were not just relics of a bygone era, but blueprints for economic exploitation and social control that ripple into the present, shaping the lives, opportunities, and perceptions of entire communities. Walking through the streets of Sugarland today, one can see how the infrastructure, neighborhoods, and institutions were molded by centuries of inequality, with generational wealth denied to those whose labor had once built the very foundations of prosperity. This is not history confined to textbooks. It is living, breathing, and visible in the schools underfunded, in the neighborhoods segregated, and in the persistent economic disparities that define who can thrive and who is left behind. The legacy of slavery and convict leasing is deeply personal and profoundly systemic. Families whose ancestors toiled in fields under the lash often find themselves navigating a society that offers symbolic freedom but substantive barriers at every turn. From property ownership and business opportunities to political representation and social mobility. The prisons that replaced plantations in Sugarland and similar towns became instruments of social engineering, ensuring that those who had once been enslaved remained tethered to cycles of labor, debt, and disenfranchisement. The stories of individuals caught in this web reveal the human cost of structural oppression, illustrating how laws, policy, and economic incentives can perpetuate injustice long after the abolition of slavery. Even as Sugarland has developed, growing into a suburban hub with shopping centers, schools, and parks, the shadows of its past remain etched into its very design. Wealth distribution, access to resources, and political power often mirror the patterns established generations ago, demonstrating that history does not merely reside in archives but is inscribed into social and spatial arrangements that dictate daily life. Efforts to confront this legacy, from educational programs to local initiatives seeking equitable investment, shine light on the possibility of change. Yet they also underscore how deeply entrenched the consequences of slavery and convict leasing are, requiring vigilance, awareness, and sustained action to address. Understanding Sugarland's story is to understand the broader American experience, where the triumphs and creativity of Black communities coexist with a history of exploitation that continues to influence opportunity and perception. It is a testament to resilience that, despite these systemic barriers, communities endure, innovate, and assert their place in society, even as the structures around them were designed to limit their progress. The lessons embedded in Sugarland are clear. History is not simply a record of the past, but a living framework that shapes the present, reminding us that confronting injustice requires not only acknowledging what was done but actively reimagining what is possible, ensuring that the mistakes of the past do not dictate the potential of the future. Traveling through the vibrant streets of many African cities, one might notice a curious paradox. The warmth extended to white foreigners often contrasts sharply with the subtle, and sometimes overt, barriers faced by Black visitors or locals from other countries. In bustling markets, in offices, or even at tourist sites, there is an unspoken hierarchy, shaped not by individual merit or behavior, but by historical legacies and global perceptions of race. This is not to romanticize any single society, for prejudice takes many forms everywhere, but the patterns reveal a stark truth. The value assigned to a person often depends on skin color, and this valuation travels across continents, shaping experiences and opportunities in ways most people rarely examine closely. In Europe, the experience can feel like a mirror turned upside down. Black travelers, students, or professionals often encounter systemic hurdles, from everyday microaggressions to institutional barriers that affect housing, employment, or policing. The same person celebrated in one part of the world for their skills or charisma might find themselves scrutinized, mistrusted, or marginalized simply because of the color of their skin. These disparities are not merely anecdotal. They are reinforced by policies, media narratives, and social structures that continue to elevate whiteness as the default standard, while casting blackness as other, often criminalized or undervalued. The cognitive dissonance is jarring. A black individual may be a welcome guest in places historically oppressed by colonization, yet simultaneously devalued in nations that long positioned themselves as the arbiters of culture and civilization. These global inequities illuminate the insidious reach of systemic racism, demonstrating that prejudice is not confined to one nation or era, but is embedded in the very frameworks of international perception and interaction. It is compounded by history, economic disparities, and the lingering myths of superiority that continue to guide societal assumptions. The consequences are tangible. Career trajectories are limited, social mobility is hindered, and the psychological toll of navigating these uneven landscapes cannot be overstated. Yet amid these challenges, there is resilience, adaptation, and a quiet defiance, as black communities around the world assert identity, cultivate networks of support, and challenge the narratives that seek to marginalize them. The contrast between reception in Africa and Europe also serves as a reminder of the arbitrary nature of racial hierarchies. What is celebrated in one context is condemned in another, revealing that prejudice is not innate but socially constructed, reinforced by institutions and culture over generations. It underscores the need for introspection, not only at the individual level but also within governments, corporations, and media, to understand how these biases perpetuate inequity globally. Recognition of these disparities is not enough. Addressing them requires deliberate action, from equitable policy making to inclusive representation, ensuring that mobility, opportunity, and dignity are not privileges contingent on skin color. Ultimately, these patterns highlight a global web of inequality where race remains a currency of power, acceptance, and exclusion. They challenge us to rethink the assumptions embedded in international interactions, to question why hospitality is extended selectively, and to confront the structures that allow prejudice to travel unimpeded across borders. Through awareness, storytelling, and persistent advocacy, the world can begin to reconcile these contradictions, acknowledging that the fight against systemic racism is both local and global, and that true equality demands dismantling the invisible hierarchies that continue to shape human experience from one continent to another. Everyday life for black people in the United States and across the world is shaped not only by overt acts of prejudice but by the subtle, persistent threads of racism woven into ordinary interactions, policies, and expectations. Threads that are so normalized they are often invisible to those who do not experience them. A casual glance, a tone of voice, or the repeated assumption of incompetence or suspicion can leave invisible scars. Each microaggression a reminder that society often measures worth not by character or achievement, but by skin color. In schools, black children may face lowered expectations, disproportionate disciplinary action, or lack of access to advanced courses, shaping trajectories long before adulthood. In workplaces, resumes with ethnically identifiable names are sometimes dismissed, while promotions and leadership opportunities remain more accessible to others, reinforcing cycles of inequality that can span generations. Even in neighborhoods, the structures of daily life, banking, transportation, healthcare, housing reflect policies and practices that privilege certain communities over others. From redlining and mortgage discrimination to unequal funding for schools and public services, creating invisible walls that limit mobility and opportunity. These barriers are compounded by the constant negotiation of safety in spaces where one's presence alone can invite scrutiny or suspicion. Walking down streets, shopping in stores, or interacting with law enforcement can involve a heightened awareness, a mental checklist of behaviors designed to avoid conflict, arrest, or violence. A reality that is almost unimaginable for those who have never had to navigate it. Media narratives reinforce these dynamics, often portraying black individuals in ways that amplify stereotypes or criminalize everyday behavior, further embedding prejudices into public consciousness and influencing decisions in courts, workplaces, and communities. Yet these challenges do not define the entirety of experience. They coexist with resilience, innovation, and agency. Black individuals and communities continually find ways to assert identity, support one another, and create spaces where culture, history, and creativity flourish despite systemic obstacles. The pervasiveness of these structures illustrates that racism is not a series of isolated incidents, but a network of practices and norms that collectively shape life chances, influence perceptions, and dictate access to resources. It is a force that subtly, persistently, and systemically undermines potential, making achievements and safety harder to attain and more difficult to sustain. The lived reality of navigating such a landscape is exhausting, as it demands vigilance, resilience, and adaptation at every turn, a daily negotiation between aspiration and the constraints imposed by societal prejudice. Understanding these dynamics requires both attention and empathy, recognizing that the effects of microaggressions, discriminatory policies, and embedded societal norms accumulate, shaping not only individual experiences but entire communities over time. It calls for awareness that goes beyond occasional outrage at visible injustices to a deeper comprehension of how everyday systems, from schools to workplaces, streets to media, continually reinforce inequality. Acknowledging this reality is the first step toward addressing it. And while the structures are entrenched, the persistent efforts of those challenging them illuminate the possibility of a society where opportunity, respect, and safety are not conditional on the color of one's skin, and where the invisible burdens carried daily can finally begin to be lifted. Throughout American history, Black Americans have continually transformed the cultural landscape, shaping music, art, literature, sports, and broader societal norms in ways that resonate far beyond their communities. Yet these contributions have always existed alongside a backdrop of systemic oppression designed to limit recognition and control influence. From the rhythm and soul of jazz that revolutionized music in the early 20th century, to the defiant poetry of the Harlem Renaissance that challenged social conventions, from the innovation and energy of hip-hop that amplifies voices worldwide to the exceptional athleticism of black athletes who redefine what is possible on courts and fields. These achievements reflect creativity, resilience, and the ability to thrive despite societal constraints. Each song, each performance, each artistic expression carries with it the echoes of struggle, resistance, and survival, yet also the undeniable affirmation of identity and pride. This influence is not confined to culture alone. It permeates social attitudes, politics, and community values, inspiring movements that advocate for justice and equality, compelling society to confront uncomfortable truths about race and privilege. Yet, the very visibility and power inherent in these contributions have historically elicited fear and resentment among those invested in maintaining racial hierarchies. White supremacist ideologies, rooted in the preservation of control and dominance, interpret black achievement as a threat, a challenge to narratives that have long justified oppression, and respond with attempts to marginalize, belittle, or erase these accomplishments. Media portrayals, political rhetoric, and cultural gatekeeping all serve to downplay influence or redirect attention in ways that perpetuate bias, reinforcing a perception that black success is anomalous rather than foundational to American identity. In communities across the nation, The tension between admiration and fear plays out in subtle and overt ways. Iconic figures become lightning rods, celebrated for their talent yet scrutinized for their prominence. Their success treated as disruptive rather than exemplary. The very innovations and leadership that have propelled Black communities forward, whether through entrepreneurial ventures, educational initiatives, or artistic expression, are often met with suspicion, undermining the natural acknowledgement and respect such contributions deserve. Nevertheless, these forces have never silenced creativity or diminished impact. Black Americans continue to shape cultural currents, redefine societal expectations, and challenge systems of oppression with ingenuity and resilience. The dynamic between systemic suppression and cultural influence illustrates the complexity of power, identity, and societal change. Black achievement is simultaneously celebrated, co-opted, feared, and resisted, reflecting both the enduring vibrancy of Black communities and the deep-seated anxieties embedded in a society structured around racial hierarchy. The ongoing narrative demonstrates that influence is inseparable from struggle, that cultural impact carries both visibility and vulnerability, and that despite opposition, the contributions of Black Americans remain transformative, defining not only the arts, sports, and entertainment, but also the moral and social evolution of the nation itself. This interplay of fear and admiration underscores a truth that has persisted for generations. The power of Black creativity and achievement is inextricable from the resilience and determination that make it possible, a testament to the enduring spirit of a people whose influence continues to reshape the world, even as it provokes discomfort among those invested in preserving inequality. Across the United States, Black communities have long demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for resilience and solidarity, a strength forged in the crucible of systemic oppression and historical marginalization, and manifested in countless ways, from everyday mutual support to organized activism that challenges entrenched injustice. In neighborhoods where resources are scarce and institutional support is inconsistent, families, neighbors, and local organizations often come together to ensure that children are nurtured, the elderly are cared for, and those facing economic or social hardship are not left to navigate adversity alone, creating networks of protection and empowerment that quietly sustain communities. This spirit of collective responsibility becomes even more pronounced when external pressures threaten safety or dignity, as seen in the way communities confront over-policing, racial profiling, or discriminatory enforcement practices, standing as witnesses to one another's struggles while actively seeking accountability and change. Stories of resilience are abundant, from mothers and fathers mentoring youth to prevent cycles of incarceration, to grassroots groups documenting abuses, to legal advocates challenging unjust practices in courts. These actions reveal a persistent refusal to accept marginalization as destiny. When a Black teenager is stopped repeatedly without cause, or when a local business is targeted unfairly, the community often rallies, combining public attention, social media advocacy, and strategic organizing to ensure that injustice does not go unnoticed. These responses are not only defensive but deeply proactive, cultivating awareness, education, and empowerment in parallel with resistance, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of both systemic structures and the levers through which change can be achieved. The interwoven nature of these protective efforts underscores a broader narrative. Black communities are not passive recipients of oppression, but active agents shaping their own destinies, even in the face of entrenched barriers. Cultural practices, from church gatherings to neighborhood associations, function as incubators for leadership, mentorship, and civic engagement, reinforcing values of mutual aid and collective responsibility. The same neighborhoods that have historically suffered neglect and discrimination also become centers of innovation in problem solving, demonstrating that solidarity is both a practical necessity and a moral imperative. Every act of advocacy, whether small, such as guiding a child safely home, or large, like organizing protests against police misconduct, contributes to a legacy of resistance and empowerment that informs present and future generations. At the same time, these communal strategies illuminate the broader societal tensions surrounding race and power. The protective measures and acts of resistance that sustain Black communities are often interpreted by outsiders through lenses of fear or suspicion, reinforcing misperceptions rather than acknowledging the humanity and wisdom inherent in these practices. Yet, despite such misinterpretation, the communities persist, innovating and adapting strategies to ensure safety, dignity, and opportunity. In confronting systemic inequities and asserting their rights, Black Americans reveal a profound insight: that collective resilience is not merely a reaction to oppression, but a powerful instrument for shaping justice, advancing social change, and affirming identity. The ongoing narrative of solidarity within Black communities exemplifies the enduring truth that strength is cultivated not in isolation but in connection, and that by protecting one another, these communities continue to challenge injustice while nurturing hope, agency, and a shared vision for a more equitable future. As we reflect on the long and painful history of fear, prejudice, and systemic oppression in the United States, it becomes clear that confronting these issues is not optional, it is essential for the health and progress of the nation. The fear that has been directed toward Black Americans for centuries is not rooted in reality, but in false narratives, envy, and the desire to maintain control, and it continues to shape institutions, policies, and social interactions in ways that hinder equality and justice. Yet, within this darkness, the resilience, creativity, and determination of Black communities illuminate a path forward, offering lessons in courage, solidarity, and the transformative power of collective action. To truly overcome fear and systemic oppression, America must engage in honest reflection, acknowledging the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, and ongoing discrimination, and recognizing the ways in which myths about race have been propagated to justify inequality. Acknowledgement is only the first step. Dismantling these myths requires deliberate education, conscious policymaking, and a willingness to challenge the assumptions that have long shaped society. This means addressing inequities in policing, education, healthcare, housing, and economic opportunity, ensuring that every individual is afforded dignity and the chance to thrive. It also means valuing and celebrating the contributions of Black Americans in every field, from science and technology to arts, sports, and culture, and rejecting narratives that erase or minimize their achievements. By embracing the full humanity of Black Americans, society affirms that justice, progress, and the collective well-being of the nation are inseparable from the recognition and empowerment of those who have historically been marginalized. The journey toward equity is not simple, and it will demand courage, commitment, and continuous effort from individuals, communities, and institutions alike. It will require listening to voices that have long been silenced, supporting policies that advance fairness, and fostering empathy and understanding across divides. Most importantly, it requires seeing Black humanity not as a threat, as many have been conditioned to believe, but as central to the moral and social fabric of the nation. Every act of advocacy, education, and solidarity strengthens the foundation for a society in which fear no longer dictates relationships, policies, or perceptions, and where justice is not a distant ideal but a lived reality. Thank you for joining this discussion and taking the time to reflect on these important truths. If you found this exploration meaningful, insightful, or inspiring, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel so that we can continue to share stories, perspectives, and analyses that matter. By engaging, sharing, and learning together, we take small but vital steps toward understanding, justice, and a future in which the fear that has long shaped America can finally be replaced with respect, equity, and hope for all.